Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. When Lauren invited me to say a few introductory words, I wrote back at once, thrilled and honored to accept. I also asked for a few guidelines. Here is part of Lauren's response. Quote, I feel guilty enough that I have asked you to do this. Just say, I'm usually not a terrible person and I have nice teeth or something. I regret to be unable to follow Lauren's suggestion tonight, mainly because part of it involves an outrageous lie. Lauren has remarkably nice teeth, yes, but it simply falls that she is usually not a terrible person. The truth is that Lauren is consistently, solidly, and almost stubbornly wonderful. And this is not just my perception, it is the monolithic consensus among all of us who know her. And I'm bringing this up not only to set the record straight, but also because Lauren's tenacious decency informs her writing. What I am trying to say is that her fiction has an ethical core that is far from fictitious. It is real, and it is true, and it is essentially Lauren. Of course, I am not implying that she writes moral fables, not at all. Her books are too beautiful and funny and complex for that. In fact, I know few authors with such a range. Lauren is capable of cosmic lyrical flights and also of the most delicious profanities. She knows how to transcribe the barely audible murmurs of a conscience and also the deafening roars of apocalyptic storms. She can painstakingly create a reality down to the last detail, only to shatter it in the most brutal, gorgeous ways, showing us that our world is a fragile construct besieged by forces over which we have no control. These forces can take many forms. It may be a wrecking ball that comes swinging from the past into the present. It may be our feral hubris preying on our better selves. Or it may be, increasingly, the rightful revenge of nature. But here is the loveliest contradiction of all. Even if Lauren's fiction teaches us so much about the world and how to live in it with some decency, her books ultimately have one main effect on me. They turn reality into some sort of epiphenomenal debris of literature. In other words, given the choice, I'd rather experience Lauren's versions of things than the things themselves. A quick example, I have never been to Cooperstown or Normandy, and I barely know Florida, and I will do my best to avoid these places for as long as I can. The last thing I want is reality interfering with the image Lauren has given me of them. There is only one exception to this, Lauren herself. Having had the enormous fortune of knowing her, hasn't interfered with her books or taken anything away from them. On the contrary, reading her, I felt she would be a great friend. And becoming her friend, I could see why she's a great writer. Please welcome the blindingly brilliant Lauren Groff.
I'm standing in the back trying not to cry as Hernán is being blindingly brilliant over there. And if you haven't read his book, you must. It's so good. So tonight I'm going to read a story from Florida called The Midnight Zone. And here we go. It was an old hunting camp shipwrecked in 20 miles of scrub. Our friend had seen a Florida panther sliding through the trees there a few days earlier. But things had been fraying in our hands, and the camp was free and silent, so I walked through the resistance of my cautious husband and my small boys, who had wanted hermit crabs and kites and wakeboards and sand for spring break. Instead, they got ancient sinkholes filled with ferns, potential death by cat. One thing I liked was how the screens at night pulsed with the tender bellies of lizards. Even in the sleeping bag with my smaller son, the golden one, the March chill seemed to blow through my bones. I loved eating, but I'd lost so much weight by then that I carried myself delicately, as if I'd gone translucent. There was sparse electricity from a gas-powered generator and no internet, and you had to climb out through the window in the loft and stand on the roof to get a cell signal. On the third day, the boys were asleep and I dimmed the lanterns when my husband went up and out, and I heard him stepping on the metal roof, a giant brother to the raccoons that woke us thumping around up there at night like burglars. Then my husband stopped moving and stood still for so long I forgot where he was. When he came down the ladder from the loft, his face had blanched. "Who died?" I said lightly, because if anyone was going to die, it was going to be us, our skulls popping in the jaws of an endangered cat. It turned out to be a bad joke, because someone actually had died that morning in one of my husband's apartment buildings. Thank you. A fifth-floor occupant had killed herself, maybe on purpose, with aspirin and vodka in a bathtub. Floors 4, 3, and 2 were away somewhere with beaches and alcoholic smoothies, and the first floor had discovered the problem only when the water of death had seeped into the carpet. My husband had to leave. He just fired one handyman and the other was on his own Caribbean adventure, eating buffet foods to the sound of cruise ship calypso. "Let's pack," my husband said, but my rebelliousness at the time was like a sticky fog rolling through my body and never burning off. There was no sun inside, and so I said that the boys and I would stay. He looked at me as if I were crazy and asked how we'd manage with no car. I asked if he thought he'd married an incompetent woman, which cut to the bone, because the source of our problems was that, in fact, he had. For years at a time, I was good only at the things that interested me, and since all that interested me was my books and my children, the rest of life had sort of inched away. And while it's true that my children were endlessly fascinating, 2 petri dishes growing human cultures, being a mother never had been. And all that seemed assigned by default of gender I would not do because it felt insulting. I would not buy clothes. I would not make dinner. I would not keep schedules. I would not make playdates. Never, ever. Motherhood meant for me that I would take the boys on month-long adventures to Europe, teach them how to blast off rockets, to swim for glory. I taught them how to read, but they could make their own lunches. I would hug them as long as they wanted to be hugged, but that was just being human. My husband had to be the one to make up for the depths of my lack. It is exhausting living in debt that increases every day, but that you have no intention of repaying. 2 days, he promised. 2 days, and he'd be back by noon on the 3rd. He bent to kiss me, but I gave him my cheek and rolled over when the headlights blazed, then dwindled on the wall. In the banishing of the engine, the night grew bold. The wind was making a low, inhuman muttering in the pines and inspired the animals let loose in call and response. Everything kept me alert until shortly before dawn, when I slept for a few minutes until the puppy whined and woke me. My older son was crying because he'd thrown off his sleeping bag in the night and was cold but too sleepy to fix the situation. I made scrambled eggs with a vengeful amount of butter and cheddar, and also cocoa with an inch of marshmallow, thinking I would stupefy my children with calories, but the calories only made them stronger. Our friend had treated the perimeter of the clearing with panther deterrent, some kind of synthetic super predator urine, and we felt safe-ish near the cabin. We ran foot races until the dog went wild and leapt up and bit my children's arms with her puppy teeth, and the boys screamed with pain and frustration and showed me the pink stripes on their skin. I scolded the puppy harshly, and she crept off to the porch to watch us with her chin on her paws. The boys and I played soccer, we rocked in the hammock, we watched the circling red-winged hawks. I made my older son read Alice's Adventures in Wonderland to the little one, which was a disaster, a book so punny and Victorian for modern cartoonish children. We had lunch. Then the older boy tried to make fire by rubbing sticks together, his little brother attending solemnly, and they spent the rest of the day constructing a hut out of branches. Then dinner, singing songs, a bath in the galvanized steel horse trough someone had converted to a cold water tub, picking ticks and chiggers off with tweezers, and that was it for the first day. There had been a weight on us as we played outside, not as if something were actually watching, but merely the possibility that something could be watching when we were so far from humanity in all that Florida waste. The second day should have been like the first. I doubled down on calories, adding pancakes to breakfast, and succeeded in making the boys lie in pensive digestion out in the hammock for a little before they ricocheted off the trees. But in the afternoon, the one light bulb sizzled out. The cabin was all dark wood, and I couldn't see the patterns on the dishes I was washing. I found a new bulb in a closet and dragged over a stool from the bar area and made the older boy hold the spinning seat as I climbed aboard. The old bulb was hot, and I was passing it from hand to hand, holding the new bulb under my arm when the puppy leapt up at my older son's face. He let go of the stool to whack at her, and I did a quarter spin, then fell and hit the floor with my head, and then I surely blacked out. After a while, I opened my eyes. 2 children were looking down at me. They were pale and familiar. One fair, one dark, one small, one big. "Mommy," the little boy said through water. I turned my head and threw up on the floor. The bigger boy dragged a puppy who was snuffling my face out the door. I knew very little except that I was in pain and that I shouldn't move. The older boy bent over me, then lifted an intact light bulb from my armpit triumphantly. I, a chicken, the bulb, an egg. The smaller boy had a wet paper towel in his hand, and he was patting my cheeks. The pulpy smell made me ill again. I closed my eyes and felt the dabbing on my forehead, on my neck, around my mouth. The small child's voice was high. He was singing a song. I started to cry with my eyes closed, and the tears went hot across my temples and into my ears. "Mommy," the older boy, the solemn, dark one, screamed. And when I opened my eyes, both of the children were crying, and that's how I knew them to be mine. "Just let me rest here a minute," I said. They took my hands. I could feel the hot hands of my children, which was good. I moved my toes, then my feet. I turned my head back and forth. My neck worked, though fireworks went off in the corners of my eyes. "I can walk to town," the older boy was saying to his brother through wadding, but the nearest town was 20 miles away. Safety was 20 miles away, and there was a panther between us and there, but also possibly terrible men, sinkholes, alligators, the end of the world. There was no landline, no umbilicus, and small boys using cell phones would easily fall off such a slick-pitched metal roof. "But what if she's all of a sudden dead and I'm all of a sudden alone?" the little boy was saying. "Okay, I'm sitting up now," I said. The puppy was howling at the door. I lifted my body onto my elbows. Gingerly, I sat. The cabin dipped and spun, and I vomited again. The big boy ran out and came back with a broom to clean up. "No," I said. "I am always too hard on him, this beautiful child who is so brilliant, who has no logic at all." "Sweetness," I said, and I couldn't stop crying because I called him Sweetness instead of his name, which I couldn't remember just then. I took 5 or 6 deep breaths. "Thank you," I said in a calmer voice. "Just throw a whole bunch of paper towels on it and drag the rug over it to keep the dog off." The little one did so methodically, which was not his style. He has always been adept at cheerfully watching other people work for him. The bigger boy tried to get me to drink water because this is what we do in our family in lieu of applying Band-Aids, which I refused to buy because they're just flesh-colored landfill. Then the little boy screamed because he'd moved around me and seen the bloody back of my head, and then he dabbed at the cut with the paper towel he'd previously dabbed at my pukey mouth. The paper disintegrated in his hands. He crawled into my lap and put his face on my stomach. The bigger boy held something cold on my wound, which I discovered later to be a beer can from the fridge. They were quiet like this for a very long time. The boys' names came back to me, at first dancing coyly out of reach, then, when I seized them in my hands, mine. I'd been a soccer player in high school, a speedy and aggressive midfielder, and head trauma was an old friend. I remembered this constant lability from one concussive visit to the emergency room. The confusion and the sense of doom were also familiar. I had a flash of my mother sitting beside my bed for an entire night, shaking me awake whenever I tried to fall asleep, and I wanted my mother not in her diminished current state, brittle retiree, but as she'd been when I was young, a small person but gigantic, a person who blocked out the sun. I sent the little boy off to get a roll of dusty duct tape, the bigger boy to get gauze for my toiletry kit, and when they wandered back, I duct taped the gauze to my head, already mourning my long hair, which had been my most expensive pet. I inched myself across the room to the bed and climbed up despite the sparklers behind my eyeballs. The boys let the forlorn puppy in, and when they opened the door, they also let the night in because my fall had taken hours from our lives. It was only then, when the night entered, that I understood the depth of time we had yet to face. I had the boys bring me lanterns, then a can opener and tuna and the beans, which I opened slowly because it is not easy supine, and we made a game out of eating, though the thought of eating anything gave me chills. The older boy brought over mason jars of milk. I let my children finish the entire half-gallon of ice cream, which was my husband's, his one daily reward for being kind and good, but by this point, the man deserved our disloyalty because he was not there. It had started raining, at first a gentle thrumming on the metal roof. I tried to tell my children a cautionary tale about a little girl who fell into a well and had to wait a week until firefighters could figure out a way to rescue her, something that maybe actually took place back in the dimness of my childhood, but the story was either too abstract for them or I wasn't making much sense. And they didn't seem to grasp my need for them to stay in the cabin, to not go anywhere if the very worst happened. The unthinkable that I was skirting, like a pit that opened just in front of each sentence I was about to utter. They kept asking me if the girl got lots of toys when she made it out of the well. This was so against my point that I said, out of spite, unfortunately, no, she did not. I made the boys keep me awake with stories. The younger one was into a British television show about marine life, which the older one maintained was babyish until I pretended not to believe what they were telling me. Then they both told me about cookie cutter sharks, which bore perfect round holes in whales, as if their mouths were cookie cutters. They told me about a fish called the humuhumanukanukawapa'a, a beautiful name that I couldn't say correctly, even though they sang it to me over and over, laughing to the tune of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. They told me about the walking catfish, which can stay out of water for 3 days, meandering about in the mud. They told me about the sunlight, the twilight, and the midnight zones, the 3 densities of water, where there is transparent light, then a murky, darkish light, then no light at all. They told me about the whirlpool, in which one current goes one way, another goes another way, and where they meet, they make a tornado of air, which stretches, said my little one, from the midnight zone, where the fish are blind, all the way up, up, up to the birds. I had begun shaking very hard, which my children, sudden gentlemen, didn't mention. They piled all the sleeping bags and blankets on me, then climbed under and fell asleep without bathing or toothbrushing or getting out of their dirty clothes, which anyway, they sweated through within an hour. The dog did not get dinner, but she didn't whine about it. And though she wasn't allowed to, she came up on the bed and slept with her head on my older son's stomach because he was her favorite, being the biggest puppy of all. Now I had only myself to sit vigil with me, though it was still early, 9 or 10 at night. I had a European novel on the nightstand that filled me with bleach and fret. So I tried to read Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, but it was incomprehensible with my scrambled brains. Then I looked at a hunting magazine, which made me remember the Florida panther. I hadn't truly forgotten it, but I could manage only a few terrors at a time, and others, when my children had been awake, were more urgent. We had seen some scat in the woods on a walk 3 days earlier, enormous scat, either a bear's or the panther's, but certainly a giant carnivore's. The danger had been abstract until we saw this bodily proof of existence, and my husband and I led the children home, singing around, all four of us holding hands, and we let the dog off the leash to circle us joyously because, as small as she was, it was bred in her bones that in the face of peril, she would sacrifice herself first. The rain increased until it was loud, and still my sweaty children slept. I thought of waves of sleep rushing through their brains, washing out the tiny, unimportant flotsam of today so that tomorrow's heavier truths could wash in. There was a nice solidity to the rain's pounding on the roof, as if the noise were a barrier that nothing could enter, a stay against the looming night. I tried to bring back the poems of my youth and could not remember more than a few floating lines, which I put together into a strange, sad poem, Blake and Dickinson and Frost and Milton and Sexton, a tag sale poem in clammy meter that nonetheless came alive and held my hand for a little while. Then the rain diminished until all that was left were scattered clicks from the drops drifting off the pines. The batteries of one lantern went out, and the light from the remaining lantern was sparse and thwarted. I could hardly see my hand or the shadow it made on the wall when I held it up. This lantern was my sister. At any moment, it, too, could go dark. I feasted my eyes on the cabin, which in the oncoming black had turned into a place made of gold. But the shadows seemed too thick now, fizzy at the edges, and they moved when I shifted my eyes away from them. It felt safer to look at the cheeks of my sleeping children, creamy as cheeses. It was elegiac, this last hour or so of light, and I tried to push my love for my sons into them where their bodies were touching my own skin. The wind rose again, and it had personality. It was in a sharpish, meanish mood. It rubbed itself against the little cabin and played at the corners and broke sticks off the trees and tossed them at the roof so they jigged down like creatures with strange and scrabbling claws. The wind rustled its endless body against the door. Everything depended on my staying still, but my skin was stuffed with itches. Something terrible in me, the darkest thing, wanted to slam my own head back against the headboard. I imagined it over and over, the sharp backward crack and the wash and spill of peace. I counted slow breaths and was not calm by 200. I counted to 1,000. The lantern flicked itself out and the dark poured in. The moon rose in the skylight and backed itself across the black. When it was gone and I was alone again, I felt the disassociation, a physical shifting, as if the best of me was detaching from my body and sitting down a few feet distant. It was a great relief. For a few moments, there was a sense of mutual watching, a wait for something definitive, though nothing definitive came, and then the bodiless me stood and circled the cabin. The dog shifted and gave a soft whine through her nose, though she remained asleep. The floors were cool underfoot. My head brushed the beams, though they were 10 feet up. Where my body and those of my two sons lay together was a black and pulsing mass, a hole of light. I passed outside. The path was pale dirt and filled with sand spurs and was cold and wet after the rain. The great drops from the tree branches left a pine taste in me. The forest was not dark because darkness has nothing to do with the forest. The forest is made of life, of light. But the trees moved with wind and subtle creatures. I wasn't in any single place. I was with the raccoons of the rooftop that were now down fiddling with a bicycle lock on the garbage can at the end of the road, with the red-winged hawk chicks breathing alone in the nest, with the armadillo forcing its armored body through the brush. I hadn't realized that I'd lost my sense of smell until it returned hungrily now. I could smell the worms tracing their paths under the pine needles and the mold breathing out new spores, shaken alive by the rain. I was vigilant, moving softly in the underbrush, and the palmetto's nails scraped down my body. The cabin was not visible, but it was present, a sore at my side, a feeling of density and airlessness. I couldn't go away from it. I couldn't return. I could only circle the cabin and circle it. With each circle, a terrible, stinging anguish built in me, and I had to move faster and faster, each pass bringing up ever more wildness. What had been built to seem so solid was fragile in the face of time, because time is impassive, more animal than human. Time would not care if you fell out of it. It would continue on without you. It cannot see you. It has always been blind to the human and the things we do to stave it off, the taxonomies, the cleaning, the arranging, the ordering. Even this cabin, with its perfectly considered angles, its veins of pipes and wires, was barely more stable than the rake marks we made in the dust that morning, which time had already scrubbed away. The self in the woods ran and ran, but the running couldn't hold off the slow shift. A low mist rose from the ground and gradually came clearer. The first birds sent their questions into the chilly air. The sky developed its blue, the sun emerged. The drawing back was gradual. My older son opened his brown eyes and saw me sitting above him. "You look terrible," he said, patting my face, and my hearing was only half underwater now. My head ached, so I held my mouth shut and smiled with my eyes, and he padded off to the kitchen and came back with peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, with a set of Uno cards, with cold coffee from yesterday's pot for the low and constant thunder of my headache, with the dog whom he let out and then fed all by himself. I watched him. He gleamed. My little son woke but didn't get up, as if his face were attached to my shoulder by the skin. He was rubbing one unbloodied lock of my hair on his lips, the way he did after he nursed when he was a baby. My boys were not unhappy. I was usually a preoccupied mother, short with them, busy, working, until I burst into fun, then went back to my hole of work. Now I could only sit with them, talk to them. I could not even read. They were gentle with me, reminded me of a golden retriever I'd grown up with, a dog with a mouth so soft she would go down to the lake and steal ducklings and hold them intact on her tongue for hours until we noticed her sitting unusually erect in the corner, looking sly. My boys were like their father. They would one day be men who would take care of the people they loved. I closed my eyes as the boys played game after game after game of Uno. Noon arrived. Noon left, and my husband still did not come. At one point, something passed across the woods outside like a shudder, and everything went quiet, and the boys and the dog all looked at me, and their faces were like pale birds taking flight. But my hearing had mercifully shut off whatever had occasioned such swift terror over all creatures of the earth, save me. When we heard the car from afar at 4 p.m, the boys jumped up. They burst out of the cabin, leaving the door wide open to the blazing light that hurt my eyes. I heard their father's voice, and then his footsteps, and he was running, and behind him the boys were running, the dog was running. Here were my husband's feet on the dirt drive. Here were his feet heavy on the porch. For a half-breath, I would have vanished myself. I was everything we had fretted about, this passive queen of chaos with her bloody duct tape crown. My husband filled the door. He is a man born to fill doors. I shut my eyes. When I opened them, he was enormous above me. In his face was a thing that made me go quiet inside, made a long, slow sizzle creep up my arms from the fingertips. Because the thing I read in his face was the worst. It was fear, and it was vast. It was elemental, like the wind itself, like the cold sun I would soon feel on the silk of my pelt. Thank you.
In his dazzling essay, The Ecstasy of Influence, Jonathan Lethem says, "I've never managed a routine book review, let alone an essay I thought worth reprinting, without first having to invent a character who'd be issuing the remarks the essay would subsequently record, and also figuring out the motivations this guy, call him Lethem, would have for working his thoughts into language." I've known this guy, Lethem, since Motherless Brooklyn, but I only met Jonathan last year when a mutual friend of ours suddenly and tragically died. Some of you may have seen the theatrical cousin of The Fortress of Solitude that Jonathan and our friend Michael Friedman made together. Among many other virtues, it embodies the philosophy that Lethem lays out in that essay. He argues for the kind of open source artistic culture that existed among Delta blues musicians, who didn't question their right to the form or the material, for whom the process of influence and variation, writing and rewriting words and melodies was the essence of creating music. It's a really hard thing to get music into the DNA of a novel, and Lethem is one of the few writers I know who can pull it off. By turning the book into a heart-stoppingly beautiful musical, Friedman and Lethem, two of the most hyperkinetic artistic intelligences I've ever known, made a new piece of work that reinvigorated its source material. Lines of dialogue from the brilliant book are sampled in the brilliant music, and then new lyrics come out of the fusion of the two. Forgive me, because I wish I could sing this for you. I'm just walking down the street, and the street is lonely. There's no one to save me, and no one for me to save. And I feel like I could be Superman. I could come and save you if only I could fly. Those lines, I was going to say represent, but the verb is are. Those lines are the ideal conversation between artists and artistic work that Lethem describes in that essay. Maybe it seemed right to bring up our friend in this introduction because The Feral Detective is fundamentally a book about loss. After, and in part because of the 2016 election, the book's narrator, Phoebe, takes off on a mad and Lethem-esque quest into the desert to find her mentor's lost daughter. When she finds her, the two of them go back to Brooklyn, where they sit in their favorite fussy breakfast joint and order, of course, paprika, salted poached eggs, and avocado toast. Sitting there in Cobble Hill, Phoebe thinks, of course the atmosphere was gutted. This was the new world, still only 2 days old. It was still here, at least in its basic lineaments and rights, but I wasn't. Lethem's innovation in the novel is to write a book about what's happened to people like Phoebe in places where they serve poached eggs and avocado toast, without writing about that place at all. Most of the novel happens in the part of the desert that Californians with typical Californianness call the wild edge. Readers who love Lethem for his embrace of characters who live on various wild edges, down-at-heel detectives, graffiti artists, American communists, or for what he can make from a classic genre form, will find those things in The Feral Detective. But there's also something new here. To my mind, this Lethem has let go of some of the density of his other books, the X-ray vision that leaves me marveling and sometimes enviously despairing at descriptions like this one from Dissident Gardens of the chess hustler, baseball revolutionary, and dirty old uncle, Lennon English. The black hair everywhere on his head was clipped to a weirdly identical length. His fuller brushes of eyebrow, his lip-smothering beard, the hair on top the same as that shooting out from around his ears as though he'd been mowed. His spinal curvature tended toward the rabbinical, his eyes toward the heretic. That beneath his stinking black coat he wore some insignias of the hippie, worn thin Woodstock t-shirt, bird perched on guitar's neck, a frayed woven sash of rainbow wool for a belt on his stained suit-bottom pants, did nothing to counter the impression of a figure heaved painfully and against steep odds into the present from the rank and degraded past. As a reader, I'm awed by that paragraph. As a human being, it makes me a little afraid to be in the same room with Jonathan. The description of Charles Heist, the eponymous feral detective, is just as good as that. But there's something new here. Phoebe is a first-person narrator who feels, like all of Lethem's characters, completely real, but whose subjectivity is airy enough to allow any of us entry. This is important because Lethem is writing about the collective experience of grief, a great cultural loss that many of us, here at the 92nd Street Y, I'm going to go out on a limb and say all of us, experienced 2 years ago in November. In the past, political grief in Lethem's work has often been embodied in orphaned or semi-orphaned children, Lionel Esrog, Mingus, and Dylan, Sergius Gauguin. When his parents go to Nicaragua to join the Sandinistas and are murdered there, Sergius is left a refugee at his Quaker boarding school. And so at night, Sergius pretended it was the guitar that was doing the crying. Weeping for his lost parents was like his parents themselves, an ambiance in its vastness unspecific, and an ocean that when you stepped dry from it, you wholly forgot. The extraordinary thing about those gorgeous sentences is what they don't do. Lethem never uses emotional moments in his fiction to wring the corresponding emotions from readers. Instead, he's expert at conveying the actual tenor of grief, our on-again, off-again relationship with it. And on that cheerful note, but I can't end on grief. I'm almost finished, but I want to add that The Feral Detective is an uncommonly lively book about what feels like the end of the world, with virtues including, but not limited to, number 1, great sex scenes. Number 2, great sex scenes with canine spectators. Number 3, an anatomy of the In-N-Out burger. And 4, I'm going out on another limb, the best scene in all literature to take place on a Ferris wheel. Let's please welcome to the stage Jonathan and Lethem both.
Wow. Thank you. Wow, Nell, that was so cool. Thank you. You made me cry and laugh a whole bunch back there, so I'm in great shape for this. Hi, everybody. Lauren was excellent, amazing, but she also had it easy. She was reading a short story. It's really hard to read from novels, and I'm going to do, instead of doing what I usually do, and what I think most novelists do with a lot of ambivalence, which is try to find like a fake short story inside the novel to read you, I'm going to read you a bunch of short moments from the book. And then end with one longer-ish one. But it's sort of like I'm skipping a stone across the surface of The Feral Detective. And Nell, you did me a great favor by introducing Phoebe a bit. So this is the narrator. It's all in her voice. She's a New Yorker who's gone out to the desert to L.A. first and then to the desert to search for a friend's missing daughter named Arabella. And she doesn't know what the hell she's doing or where she's come to. It's all really alien and peculiar to her. But this is also at a time when she's alienated from herself and from New York and from reality. She's in a kind of free fall, even if she's only half acknowledged it. So Phoebe's a narrator who's kind of all over the place. And I think that's what this reading will be, too, because I'm trying pages that I've never read aloud from the book before. You probably can't see this, but there are these isolated paragraphs, these tiny little chapters here and there, and it's my envy of poetry. I wanted some white space on the page. So I'm reading a bunch of these crypto poems from the book to warm you up, and then I'll read a little more substantial bit. And I'll explain when I have to, or I won't. I don't know. This is chapter 2 of the book. In case it isn't obvious, there's a detective in this story, but I'm not it. I had myself halfway cast in the role when I got on the plane, but no, sorry. Then again, the story does involve a missing person, and it could well be me. Or you, or practically anybody. As he said to me once, who's not missing? He was prone to these low-ebb, oracular remarks. To my surprise, I learned to like them. The he she's speaking of there is Charles Heist, the feral detective himself. But you're not going to see a lot of him in this reading. I'm doing other stuff. This is chapter 6. So she's been stuck in the Inland Empire, which is a weird part of America. That's where I live right now. That encompasses a lot of sprawling suburbs between the Los Angeles you think of when you're a New Yorker, the one I always thought of, which is Santa Monica and Hollywood and all the glamorous stuff that Woody Allen makes fun of in Annie Hall. But this isn't that Los Angeles. It's a big, kind of indistinct set of towns and cities that are on the edge of the desert. And she's really confused by it, as I was when I first got there. So on this chapter 6, she's looking for help. She's kind of throwing herself a lifeline, and she finds an old friend on Facebook, a college acquaintance, not a good friend, who's the only person she knows who lives in LA. And this person lives in LA proper, in Culver City, where she works at a glamorous gallery. So she's headed into LA proper from her exile in the Inland Empire. And this is chapter 6, and then I'll read chapter 7, actually, which is a little more substantial. Her friend's name is Stephanie. The GPS instructed me to merge onto Interstate 10 West towards Los Angeles. But in the robot's voice, it sounded like lost and jealous. The sea change from the suburban desert interior, of which there had been stunning miles to traverse before I'd seen downtown passing on the right, was unaccountable. As the miles peeled beneath the tires, I thought of Arabella. That's the runaway girl. I thought of Arabella, the western distances she'd had to go to make her disappearance. How many exactly I had yet to know. The last I'd seen Arabella in person, she'd been musing on what I then thought was her little joke about finding Leonard Cohen. Don't you go hitchhiking now, I said to her. It isn't 1972 anymore, except in your heart. Don't worry, I won't, she'd said with a teenager's glum exasperation. I hadn't forced her to promise. Now, each mile ticked in me, a metronome of self-reproach. If I could have Arabella back now, I'd have tried to insert a tracking microchip under the skin at the nape of her neck, like they do with cats and dogs at the adoption shelter. Chapter 7. So now Phoebe's at dinner with Stephanie, who works at the gallery. I may have been to blame, but by the time of our meal's second course, I figured I'd never call Stephanie again and might even block her if I didn't have the brass to unfriend. Of course, that's when the conversation got interesting, at least a little. Everyone's trying to get out of New York, she informed me, in what I suppose she intended as a kind of congratulation. You're not even ahead of the curve. Out here it's like, what took you so long? I don't need to be ahead of the curve, I said. It's a chance for me to drink some water. I don't need to be ahead of the curve, I said. In fact, I was a little stunned to find myself in an outrageously expensive restaurant, one with a low glow of orange light at each table and an actual fourth-tier, but identifiable, movie actor at the bar. The sheer urbanity in the decor and clientele had actually thrown me for a loop. Nothing in Upland or Claremont had challenged my New Yorker's sense of superiority. But Stephanie had me meet her at the gallery first, where glam bohemian staff and collectors, women in leather jackets and heels, men in beards and T-shirts, browsed what seemed an entire city block of white walls and unfathomable objects, making me feel by their blasé fabulousness very much the poor little match girl by comparison. You become yourself out here, said Stephanie now. How so, I asked. In New York, she said, that caffeinated, neurotic atmosphere guarantees you think something important is happening every single second of your life. In fact, you're just eating shit. I mean, literally, so unhealthy, you just can't even look at yourself in the mirror. And you ride the subway to some job that barely pays your rent, and the only reason you don't know it sucks is that 1,000 other people are telling you how lucky you are. Stephanie could look at herself in the mirror, I'd wager that. She wore a sleeveless black dress showing gym-sculpted arms so teenage boyish they made me a little hot. I braced myself for an infomercial on the benefits of a diet of sheer avocado. Instead, she said, with the space around here, you can't kid yourself. You have to wake up every day and you have to decide who you are in a total void. She might have been talking about me in my room at the Doubletree Inn. I put down my fork, which had been continuously employed in the cause of departure. Funny you should say that, I told her. I think I've been undergoing a sort of void encounter myself these past couple of days. Stephanie shrugged. It's impossible not to. I felt like the mountains were too close and too far away at the same time, I said. Wild edge, she said enigmatically. What's that? LA has more of it than any city in the world, she said. Wild edge. City right up against whatever. The mountains, the sea, the desert. That's crazy, I said. I couldn't gratify her with anything less equivocal than that. She continued to explain it. You can feel the civilization of this kind of thin layer that's just been troweled onto the landscape. It's like everything's provisional. Well, I thought, on the one hand, there's mansplaining, and on the other, there's the sound of a woman quoting the mansplaining to another woman. She confirmed this guess. This artist we're working with, she said, that's actually the title of his upcoming show, Wild Edge. And whom you've fucked or are about to be fucking, I thought. Stephanie turned red enough that she didn't need to say it. And I suddenly wanted everything she had, practically including the portobello and groats on her barely fussed-with plate. Her head start in fleeing to Los Angeles, her Culver City version of the void encounter, so much less tawdry than my own. I'd been calculating through the meal how soon I could get my rental car from the valet and drive east to the Doubletree. Now I wanted to leverage a night on Stephanie's couch. There's plenty of wild edge, I said, but there's a surplus of everything else, too. A boggling amount of son and los, and with a side order of rancho. I was getting defensively goofy. I felt we'd come to that juncture where you allude to the man in your life in order to claim you've got one. A life, that is. I thought, absurdly, of mentioning Charles Heist, or asking if she'd heard of the feral detective. Knowing Heist had something in common with having a man in my life he never called. Where are you again, she said. Montclair, I said. I mean, Claremont. I was too embarrassed to say Upland for some reason. It's a really different scene from this. I waved my hand in the approximate direction of the movie star. I've never had a reason to go. I felt this as a sudden withdrawal of her sympathies. Yeah, well, if there's a Midwest of Los Angeles, I think I've found it, I said. Earlier, I told her I was looking for a lost friend, nothing more. Now it occurred to me she might think the friend was myself and not be entirely wrong. I tried another joke. There's nothing but there, I said. Stephanie wasn't buying. After this glance into each other's voids, there was little left for me and Stephanie to do but deplore the orange monster for a while and say no to dessert. We crossed these items off the list, and I kept my promise and picked up the check. The return drive on Interstate 10 in the dark and still in gusts of rain was baldly terrifying. It was hardly less crowded than at rush hour. If the 6 lanes of red taillights were a video game, it would have been called Shoot of Death. In fact, at the crest of an ear-popping hill, I came to a famous cemetery, one with its own freeway exit, on the other side of which the Inland Empire spread before me, looking like the proverbial blanket of tinsel. As it would happen, not much later, crouching around a fire in the desert, I'd hear it explained that the hill crowned by the cemetery marked the point at which, in a future of rising sea levels, the Pacific would be exhausted in its encroaching from the west. These immaculate gravestones littered a chunk of future beachfront. Suck on that, wild edge. So, I'm skipping a bunch to another tiny chapter, chapter 19, where she's gone through a lot of very grueling, weird stuff in the desert and met a lot of these crazy desert dwellers who are sort of off-the-grid types. And she's really having to try to remember who she is or was. She's not sure which it is. She's not sure she still is who she was. But she used to work for the New York Times. And so she kind of grabs onto that lifeline in her thinking. Here at the new summit of my abjection and passivity, at least in my adult lifetime, I began to dissociate. My disassociation took a particular form that was hardly useful, but may be interesting to report. In a reverie so rapidly designed by my subconscious that it was as if it had been pre-formatted for convenience, I had in fact not quit my job at the Great Gray Lady, but instead taken a remarkable assignment. An op-ed, a special full page intended for the first Sunday after the inauguration. You, Phoebe Siegler, are uniquely suited to infiltrate and explicate to us the great out there, which we at the editorial board are at last ready to admit we don't understand in the faintest. I should underline what horseshit this was. I'd never been asked to write a thing. As at the literary journal, I'd been a decorative editorial flunky, a limit I'd never fought my way free of. That was partly my fault. Hey, it wasn't as if I'd gone around pitching brilliant ideas for op-eds, and the witticisms that turned the heads of the men around me were more in the cause of charming self-deprecation than of carving my way out of the category of the highly dateable. But in this fantasy, I was on a brilliant assignment into the underground that the election had in fact revealed as our nation's dominant paradigm. Sew a Peppy the Frog medallion onto your backpack, young lady, and go seduce the unspeakable and hairy, then report back. Tell us where the hell we are. The total incoherence of this fantasy didn't blunt its consoling sweetness. Nancy Drew was defunct, replaced by Joan Didion, a female reporter from the outer limit whose meekness in the given moment would be revenged in sublime verbal retrospect. Okay, so now I'm going to read just a stretch of pages, and then I'll be done. And this, do you remember when she's driving and she remembers, or she thinks about how later she's going to have been by a fire in the desert? Well, this is that fire, and this is that desert, and this is this guy who tells her about the coming floods and how they'll reach that part of Los Angeles. The guy who talks in the first part of this sequence is really a kid, like a college kid, a runaway, and he's actually from a really wealthy family, but he's gone off the grid in that way that sometimes the most privileged can most easily do. And Phoebe is with Arabella now. She's rescued her. And this is the aftermath of the rescue. And they're sitting with a bunch of women, mostly women, by this fire in the aftermath of their adventure. And this college kid who's gone into the desert is talking a lot. A bit later, we were awake again. The temperature had dropped. Someone had built up the fire. It still rained lightly, but the clouds now showed gaps where the stars raged through. Spark and her nameless Jesus-y boy crawled within our shelter. We four shared a joint and listened for a while as he talked about the coming flood, the places in the desert that would soon be beachfront, the drowned cemeteries and malls. The boy had a lot of facts about water. He also told us nuclear war was only a metaphor. I broke into his monologue at this point. It's not a metaphor, I said. I know why you would say that. His tone was very understanding. But think about this for a minute. The things we're taking out of the ground and roasting into the atmosphere, they're made of atoms, right? The word nuclear comes from nuclei. I know that, I said. The stratum of particulate matter that's shrouding the sun and boiling the dolphins in the sea, it's basically nuclear winter in slow motion. Did you ever see that movie where Inspector Clouseau is a German scientist in a wheelchair who wants to take all the beautiful women down into an underground fallout shelter? Sure, volunteered Arabella. My dad made me watch that movie like a dozen times before I was 12. That's not surprising, said the Jesus-y boy. It means a lot to people of a certain age. They talk about the Cold War like it's something that they survived or averted. Actually, it's a record of something that's still happening, and we're trapped inside it. The bombs already fell, but they're also still falling. The bombs are named Ford and CIA and Google. When I was at Davos, I realized these people are basically just Inspector Clouseau, rich people planning a really sexy bomb shelter for when the dark falls on the rest of us. Wait, I said, you were at Davos? Once, yeah, he said. My parents go every year. It only took me one visit to understand, though. Sometimes it's easiest to hide the truth in plain sight. What truth is that? I said. They're not going underground, he said. That would be stupid. The water flows downward, remember? They're going to the mountaintops. That's what Davos is. Okay, I said. Well, first of all, I think you mean Dr. Strangelove, not Inspector Clouseau. Second, I don't think the two things are the same. In truth, I was no longer even sure what two things I meant weren't the same, only that elements had drifted together that would have to be put apart in order to think about them straight. It was possible that what I meant was my life. I was in the desert, drinking something from a communal bowl that I'd been told was called Mormon tea. The sun was coming up, and Donald Trump had been president for a whole day. Not only was I not writing an op-ed or a Harper's folio, I was debating Peter Sellers and Davos with a trust fund Jesus who was tripping on datura seeds. And I might even lose the debate. Then Arabella looked at me and said, "Too much bear-splaining." And we both began shrieking with laughter. Okay, now I have to stop and explain for a minute. So the desert folk have broken into two tribes, the rabbits and the bears. And loosely, approximately, the rabbits are women and leftists and vegans and child-rearing people, and the bears are kind of like libertarian Robert Bly biker dudes. Then Arabella looked at me and said, "Too much bear-splaining," and we both began shrieking. "What?" said the nameless boy, alarmed. "Bear-splaining," said Arabella through laughter. "The world is ending. Okay, we get it." "I'm not a bear," said the Jesus-y boy. He came off a little sulky. "Whatever," said Arabella. "Just splaining then." "Sing," I commanded to Arabella, or maybe I pleaded. "Show him what you mean." Splain, rain, was a joke Arabella and I had originated months before in Rosalind's backyard in Cobble Hill. The canopy of trees, the narrow, high-fenced yard, Rosalind's tulips, and plate of tea sandwiches. Even before we could return there in an airplane, the joke brought us back there. This was something I needed as badly as I'd ever needed anything. "I can't stand the splain against my window." Arabella had a beautiful voice, a trained voice. She'd fronted a band a few times at St. Anne's parties, 3 punk boys not worthy of backing her. Next I said, "Do Splainy Night in Georgia." "I don't know that one," she said. "I played it for you," I told her. "I'm disappointed. What about It's Splainin' Men?" "No," she said. "Wait, remember this one? Splain drops keep falling on my head." I joined her, though I wasn't any kind of singer. Miraculously, across the fire, the rabbit guitar was picked up and strummed in accompaniment, the right chords, so far as my limited ear could tell. Now, Arabella and I were up at the fire, dancing as she sang. The sky blazed with dawn shards, the storm bearing the night off with it. We swayed at the rim of cinders, she in her blue camouflage hoodie, me in my juicy couture. I heard a waking rabbit groan, "What's going on?" "The 2 Phoebes are dancing," someone told her. "It's a happy thing." The guitarist, a droll, gap-toothed woman with a head the shape of a pomegranate, rose and danced with us, still rollicking on her instrument. Arabella improvised from the melody and lyrics, loading it up with copious American Idol melisma. "Splainy splain drops, splainy sidewalks, because we're freaks, nothing's worrying me." She could have been a queen of anything she wished. Certainly something more than rabbits or bears. In her youth's splendor, she could have conquered cities. I screamed, "It won't be long till happiness steps up to greet me." And it sounded fine. It sounded terrific. The sun came up. The rain stopped. We still danced. Arabella switched the song. I can see clearly now, the splain is gone. She sang, and we dancing rabbits, 5 or 6 now, screamed it with her while the others watched and clapped. The guitarist knew this song, too. Donna came up the hill then and took me by the sleeve. She wanted to lead me back to Neptune Lodge. This is a rabbit headquarters, sort of. She wanted to lead me back to Neptune Lodge, where she and Anita had disappeared for a while without my paying attention. And why should I have? The reason she'd sought me out wasn't clear. Was it something about heist? Some news? No. There's something you'll want to see, I think, she said. They led me inside to a small television on the kitchen counter. The satellite dish worked. The station was CNN. The images of the cities in the east, Boston, New York, Washington, streets flooding with bodies and signs, with jubilant pink, the march. I'd been tracking the burgeoning scheme in my feed for weeks, but like everything in the desert except for the desert, it had become unreal to me. Now it was a grainy feed that was also like a pure injection of who I'd been into whatever it was I'd become. My people were there, revealed in their secret mighty numbers. Tears belched from me to see them in exultant riot, in knit uterine hats, blaring their raw oceanic refusal into the face of the monster. He, who you couldn't help guessing, looked on, raging like a pitiable infant. But my people were also on this side of the screen. That they'd wanted to lure me in to see, that it mattered to them at all, caused me to see the march as a rabbit event, a fulfillment and reply to what we'd endured in the night in our war with the bears. Later that same day, arrived with Arabella at the Ontario, California airport, I'd find an outlet for my charger, and my reawakened cell phone would flood with the images, the texts and selfies. But for now, there was only this, the satellite's feed. Enough. We watched a while, and then I went back to the daylight fire and to beautiful singing Arabella. I can see all obstacles in my way. This was a much better song than the earlier one, really. The word splain had fallen away now. It had done its work. Here is that rainbow I've been praying for. The morning sky, short of the rainbow, lived up to the song. I took the lipstick from my purse a second time. This time, Spark allowed me to apply it to her. She leaned in, closed her eyes. Arabella shared it too, and others as it was passed like a joint around the circle. I think I can make it now, the pain is gone. While we danced and Arabella sang, the rabbits pointed to the far hill. Again, they wanted my attention. Excuse me. I turned to see a non-human living thing, a line segment streaming in our direction. It was Jesse the dog wagging his tail. He coursed into the rabbit circle and into my arms. I had all I needed. Thank you.
Thank you both.
Is this yours? Oh,
Just a few questions from the audience before the book signing. Jonathan, the first one is for you. This person asks, are there any Bolaño allusions found in Phoebe's surreal journey? Which work or works by Bolaño were you most influenced by as you wrote The Feral Detective, if any?
It's such an embarrassing question because I wrote a whole book under the spell of Bolaño a little while ago called Chronic City. I had just discovered the Wild Detectives and then 2666 and written about 2666, and the freedom of his work unshackled something in me, and that book came flooding out, and it was really so strongly connected. And here I go, and I titled this book in a way that evokes him so much for people, and I totally didn't think of him once in the entire project. It was not my point of reference this time. And my German publisher, it turns out the word feral doesn't really translate, so their title for it is exactly the same as his book, essentially, but in the singular. It's Der wilde Detektiv. And it was like, duh. But I never got it until people pointed it out to me.
What were some of your points of reference for this book?
Oh, well, I mean, I was thinking about Chandler and Ross MacDonald, of course, with the Southern California hard-boiled motifs and the voice. But I was also thinking about a lot of my favorite examples of, encouraging examples of men doing women in first person, which is something I'd never tried before. So Norman Rush's Mating, and Philip K. Dick's The Transmigration of Timothy Archer. Both books that seem just incredible to me, how they make a character real against those odds, and I wanted to try. And, a lot of other things. We should take the next question. Yeah. But I didn't think of Bologna once, because I'm an idiot.
Yeah. You're not an idiot. Similar question, though, for Lauren while Lauren is here. Points of reference for a work like Florida, which is obviously different because it's a collection of short stories written over a period of time, but interested to hear you talk about it.
Yeah, so in the stories themselves, I reference Guy de Maupassant, who actually saved my life when I was an exchange student in France. And I have this really complicated relationship with him now. I both love him and I hate him very much.
Say the writer's name again.
Guy de Maupassant, yes, yeah, the French, primarily short story writer, but he, I think he was amazing the beginning part of his career, and then he got tertiary syphilis, which affected his brain, and made him misogynistic in a very real way. And I love William Bartram. He comes up in the stories too. He was this Quaker naturalist who came through Georgia and Florida in 1774. I actually fell in love with him as a person. There are so many people. If you write short stories, it's almost as though that it's viewed as a subsidiary art form in terms of fiction. I don't view it as that, but the rest of the world does. And so as you're writing a short story, you pay homage to all the incredible short story writers who are out there. So I was thinking of a lot of people like Alice Munro, like Deborah Eisenberg, like Laurie Moore, like the Chekhov, like the true masters of the form also in a lot of ways.
This next one is for you.
Oh,
also.
I stay.
This person says, your writing seems to have a very exact geography. I grew up in Gainesville and quickly knew that Ghosts and Empties was set there. Mm-hmm. Do you agree that precise geography is characteristic of your writing, and is that a deliberate artistic choice?
So one of the things that was underlying a lot of the stories in this book was I was entranced by the Situationists for a while, and Guy Debord and all these incredible people who think about the way that geography has a profound effect upon the psyche. And I believe that it's actually very true. Because the writing that I did when I lived in the North, in Cooperstown, is very profoundly different from the writing that I've done elsewhere. And I started to think about why and how that happens. And I do believe that just as geography has a series of small and incredibly important everyday effects upon your ideas and who you are as a person. And so the person that I am in Florida, with the humidity, with the swamp, with the bugs flying at your face, and the fear of panthers and alligators, is a different person than the person in the cold, glacial Cooperstown area with mountains and a lot of secrets. So I actually believe in geography as a former of character and characteristic.
There's a related question that Jonathan, maybe you would tackle first, which is that for people who in the relative recent years moved to drastically different places, how do you inhabit those newish places as an artist?
Well, I mean, there's actually so James Joyce was asked about his tools or what a writer needs, and his famous quip was silence, exile, and cunning. And you know, I've actually made a lot of use of exile, even in writing about the place I'm from, Brooklyn and New York City, and sometimes where I was living while I conceived those books. But I ran away a lot to write about New York. I wrote Motherless Brooklyn in Saratoga Springs and in Maine, and I wrote The Fortress of Solitude while I was living in Toronto for a while. Dreaming my way back to places is actually really valuable. It's like I build a little diorama of the city or the block I grew up on, and I re-enter it. And that desire, that appetite to re-inhabit it drives the work. And so I've often, you know, I encountered the desert first as an image. I became fascinated with it as a piece of American iconography in like John Ford movies and just accounts, you know, I mean, even just the way that George Harriman draws the desert behind Crazy Cat and Ignatz Mouse, and or Dr. Seuss drawing those trees that turn out not to be, you know, imaginary. There really are spaces that look like Dr. Seuss deserts. And then I got to go there, and it was really unfathomably resonant for me, but it was also opaque. I was pressing against the surface of something that I couldn't understand, and how human life made itself in that space was very difficult for me to grasp. But that desire was a kind of exile in real time. You know, I was writing against the pressure of not knowing the place. I think Ian McEwan has a quip about if you want to write about a foreign city, you should only visit it for 10 days or something. Well, that seems a little brief to me, but there's, you know, there's a way in which you can be too close to a place to write about it, I think.
You ever going to come back to New York?
I don't know. I mean, I'm back here now. I like to be here. I have an amazing job teaching at Pomona College, and I have children who are Southern Californians now. I don't know if I can change the situation.
Lauren, I know, has boys who are Floridians. What is is there an active translation when you have children who are from a different place than you're from?
I don't know. I don't know. They are Floridian in certain aspects, but they're also my children, so they're going to be bound to my peculiar way of seeing things no matter what. Like, they're the only children in Florida who hate football. Because I've gotten so many megalomaniacal screeds about how it's like racist and it's really, really terrible for their brains. You know, I think it does form them. I mean, they are very familiar with reptiles and they love them in a way that they never would be if they lived up here. But they're also, you know, they're my kids, unfortunately, for them. Yeah.
Here's another question for you both, but Lauren, okay, you go first, please. What is your favorite thing about your writing, and what is your least favorite thing about your writing?
My writing?
Your writing.
Oh, this is cruel. So my favorite thing about my writing is when it's happening, right? So it's a way of seeing the world in an acute manner. So when you're deep in a novel, particularly a novel, everything in the world speaks to you of the novel. So you go to the grocery store and you see something, a gesture that someone makes, and that is exactly the thing that you needed for the book. And it's almost as though there's a substratum beneath the reality of the world that is sort of pouring upwards, like the aquifer, into your daily life. And in that feeling of being almost mystically connected is something that I long for when I'm not there. And the thing that I like the least in my writing is so private that if I were to share it with you, then I would feel ashamed. And that's it.
You beat me to all the good answers. That was so deft. You know, so Nell was talking about my ecstasy of influence, my preference for quotation, and for making myself out of a tissue of other beings, other texts. Thomas Berger, who was a really pivotal writer for me when I discovered him, when he was asked why he wrote, his single line answer was, because it isn't there. Inverting the famous, why do you climb mountains? Because it's there. And that's like that sensation of living twice as much life. It's the company of my characters and the presence of another world that I'm participating in as well as constructing that is such I'm an addict of that experience. I've treated myself lavishly to it my whole life, and I can't imagine being without it. So because it isn't there. But there's another reply, which might be useful for you in the future. Bernard Malamud was asked why he wrote, and he said, I would be too moved to say.
Here's the last one, and Jonathan, it starts with you. It says, this person asks, Nell Freudenberger mentioned your musical collaboration with Michael Friedman. What was the experience of working with Ed Norton on the film adaptation of Motherless Brooklyn?
Oh, that's an unfair question because I didn't really work on either project, first of all. I was gifted with Michael Friedman's and his collaborators, Daniel Auken, the director, and Itamar Moses, who wrote the book. Having that musical come into being was one of the most uncanny gifts. You can't be a writer and plan or expect to have an experience like that. And the fact that it was The Fortress of Solitude, which was a very intensely emotional, confessional book for me about my childhood. And as you just heard, the one thing I am not gifted at is singing, and I nevertheless did a little bit of it for you. But to have these pieces of myself thrown onto a stage and embodied in music was so extraordinary. I'll cry if I start talking about it again. And Michael was a genius, just a blazing genius, and a human a presence that was unforgettable too. I'm very curious to see what the Motherless Brooklyn film looks like, and I've really enjoyed having absolutely nothing to do with it. I've never even seen the script. It was a thing where Edward Norton 20 years ago took me up on a kind of a dare. I said to him, the movies I like from books are not like the books. And he said, that's great, because I'm not going to consult you. And then we've been acquaintances ever since. So now he's made a movie, and I guess I'm going to find out. I'll be an unusually invested member of the audience, but that's what I'll be. So ask me in a year.
Lauren, is there going to be a film of Fates and Furies?
Maybe. It was optioned for a 9-part HBO series. But in truth, as soon as a book is published, it's no longer yours, it's the reader's. So I actually don't want to be involved either. I think it's probably safer and kinder for you as a person not to be involved with your own adaptations. And I've already cast the HBO show in my head, but that doesn't mean that it's actually going to happen. Who knows? I would like for it to happen just for the, I would like to send my children to school, to college. But if it doesn't, that's fine too. It's good.
Yeah. Who's casting it in your head?
Oh, okay. Oh, God. No, I will save that too. I'll be very coy.
I'll ask her backstage and let you all know. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Jonathan and Lauren. It'll be a book signing.